The Greek fleet cut through the Aegean, a dark wave of vengeance and ambition. When they reached the shores of Troy, they were met not with an open battle, but with the sight of the city's legendary walls. They were immense, impossibly high, said to have been built by Apollo and Poseidon. They rose from the plains like a cliff face of stone and defiance, and atop them the Trojan warriors, led by their noble prince Hector, stood ready. The war was not what the Greeks had imagined. It was not a single glorious clash of armies, but a slow, grinding, and protracted siege. The Greeks made their camp on the beach between their ships and the city walls. It became a sprawling, temporary city of its own, a place of wood huts, flickering campfires, and the constant, restless sound of the sea. 10 years passed. 10 years of the same sun rising over the Trojan citadel and setting into the sea behind the Greek ships. 10 years of seasons turning, of boys growing into young men who had never known a world without war. The fighting was not continuous. It came in bursts, fierce skirmishes on the plain between the city and the sea, raids on neighboring towns for supplies and treasure, and formal duels between champions. In between, there was the long, wearying business of waiting. The soldiers would mend their armor, sharpen their swords, and tell stories around the fire, their gazes forever fixed on the impassive walls of Troy. Inside those walls, life also went on, but under a shadow of constant threat. The Trojans, led by their aged and revered King Priam, put their faith in their walls and in their greatest champion, Hector. Hector was everything his brother Paris was not. He was a devoted husband to his wife, Andromache, a loving father to his infant son, Astyanax, and a selfless protector of his people. He fought not for glory or for passion, but out of a deep, abiding duty to defend his home. He was the anchor of Troy. The gods, too, were not idle spectators. They chose sides, their ancient rivalries playing out on the mortal battlefield below. Hera and Athena, still nursing their grudge from the judgment of Paris, aided the Greeks at every turn, shrouding their favorites in mist or deflecting Trojan spears. Aphrodite, true to her promise, protected Paris, once spiriting him away from a duel with Menelaus, just as the Spartan king was about to claim his revenge. Apollo, the archer god, favored the Trojans, sending plagues upon the Greek camp and guiding the arrows of Trojan warriors. The war on earth was but a reflection of a war in the heavens, and the mortals were their pawns, their lives and deaths subject to divine whim. The central figure of the Greek army, their greatest and most fearsome asset, was Achilles. When he fought, he was like a force of nature, unstoppable and terrifying. But his pride was as great as his skill. In the 10th year of the war, a plague sent by Apollo swept through the Greek camp. The seer Calchas revealed it was punishment for Agamemnon's having taken Chryseis, the daughter of a priest of Apollo, as a war prize. Agamemnon, forced by the army's outcry to return the girl, flew into a rage. To reassert his authority and soothe his wounded pride, he did the unthinkable. He seized Achilles' own war prize, a captive girl named Briseis. For Achilles, this was an unforgivable public insult. It was not about the girl herself, but about his honor, his time, the respect and status he was due as the greatest warrior. His pride wounded to the core, Achilles made a fateful decision. He would not fight. He withdrew to his tent by the shore, taking his elite soldiers, the Myrmidons, with him. There he sat, fuming, playing his lyre and watching the sea, refusing all pleas to return to battle. He even prayed to his mother Thetis, asking her to persuade Zeus to favor the Trojans, so that the Greeks would suffer, and Agamemnon would come to realize how much he needed him. Without Achilles, the tide of the war turned dramatically. The Greek morale faltered. Hector, sensing the shift, led the Trojan forces into daring, aggressive assault. They pushed the Greeks back across the plain, breaching their defensive rampart and threatening to set fire to their ships, which would trap them on the shore and seal their doom. The greatest Greek heroes, Diomedes, Ajax, Odysseus, fought with desperate courage, but they could not stop the Trojan onslaught. Hector seemed invincible, a blazing storm of bronze and courage. The Greeks were on the verge of total collapse. It was then that Patroclus, Achilles' dearest friend and companion, could bear it no longer. He went to Achilles' tent, his face wet with tears for his dying comrades. He begged Achilles to return. When Achilles, his pride still a cold, hard knot in his chest, refused, Patroclus made a desperate plea. If Achilles would not fight, let him, Patroclus, wear Achilles' divine armor and lead the Myrmidons into battle. The sight of the famous armor alone might frighten the Trojans and give the Greeks a chance to regroup. Achilles, moved by his friend's love and sorrow, reluctantly agreed, but he gave a solemn warning. "Drive the Trojans from the ships," he said, "but do not pursue them to the walls of Troy. Do not let your success go to your head. Once the ships are safe, you must return." Patroclus, his heart soaring with a warrior's joy, donned the magnificent armor. When he emerged, the Greeks let out a great cheer. They thought Achilles had returned. He led the Myrmidons in a ferocious charge, and the effect was immediate. The Trojans, terrified at the sight of what they believed to be Achilles, broke and fled. Patroclus fought like a man possessed, cutting down Trojan after Trojan, his heart swelling with a fatal pride. In the heat of his triumph, he forgot Achilles' warning. He drove the Trojans from the ships, across the plain, and all the way to the very walls of Troy. But there, his doom awaited him. The god Apollo, cloaked in mist, struck him from behind, knocking off his helmet and stunning him. A young Trojan speared him, and finally the great Hector moved in and delivered the final fatal blow. As Patroclus lay dying, Hector stripped him of Achilles' glorious armor, a final act of desecration. The news was brought to Achilles in his tent by the sea. When he heard that Patroclus was dead, a terrible, inhuman cry of grief tore from his throat. He poured dust and ashes over his head, tearing at his hair, his body racked with a sorrow so profound it shook the very earth. The sulking, prideful hero was gone, consumed by a grief that was about to transform into a terrible, all-consuming wrath. His honor was no longer the issue. All that mattered was vengeance. The most devastating chapter of the Trojan War was about to be written in the blood of Hector. The grief of Achilles was a storm. It was not a quiet sorrow, but a raging physical force that left him hollowed out, filled with a singular, terrifying purpose. His mother, Thetis, rose from the depths of the sea to comfort him, her heart breaking for the son she knew was now irrevocably on the path to his own prophesied death. He would have his revenge, but in killing Hector, he would seal his own fate. "I must go," Achilles told her, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I must kill the man who killed my friend. Then I will accept my own death, whenever it may come." He had no armor, for Hector now wore his. Thetis went to Hephaestus, the smith god, and begged him to forge a new set for her son. In his volcanic forge, with his Cyclops helpers, Hephaestus created a masterpiece. The shield was a work of divine art, a microcosm of the entire world. On its surface were depicted the heavens and the earth, cities at peace and at war, fields being plowed, people dancing at a festival, and the great, encircling river of Oceanus. It was a shield that contained all of life, and it was to be wielded by a man who now cared only for death. When Achilles donned this new God-forged armor, he shone with a terrible, otherworldly light. He publicly reconciled with Agamemnon, who returned Briseis and offered immense gifts. But Achilles cared for none of it. He refused to eat or drink. A cold, black fire of rage was his only sustenance. He let out a war cry that sent shivers of fear through both armies, and he strode into battle. His return was not a charge, it was a slaughter. He moved through the Trojan ranks like a reaper through a field of wheat, a blur of bronze and divine fury. The river Scamander, choked with the bodies of the men he killed, rose up in anger against him. But Achilles, aided by Hephaestus, fought the very river and won. He was no longer just a man. He was an instrument of vengeance, a force of nature that could not be stopped. The terrified Trojans fled before him, scrambling for the safety of their city gates. Soon, only one Trojan remained outside on the plain, Hector. He stood, his heart torn. He knew he couldn't defeat Achilles. He was shamed by his own hubris, which had led him to keep his army on the plain overnight, leading to this massacre. His aging parents, Priam and Hecuba, cried down from the ramparts, begging him to come inside to save himself. His wife Andromache watched from another tower, her heart a stone of ice. But Hector's honor would not let him retreat. He had to face his fate.
As Achilles, shining like a deadly star, bore down on him, Hector's courage finally broke. He turned and ran. And so began a strange and terrible chase. The greatest hero of Troy fled from the greatest hero of Greece, and they circled the mighty city 3 times. The gods watched from Olympus, their hearts heavy. Zeus even took out his golden scales, placing the fates of the 2 heroes upon them. The scale holding Hector's fate sank down, sealing his doom. Finally, the goddess Athena, disguised as Hector's brother Deiphobus, appeared at his side, promising to fight with him. Emboldened, Hector stopped. He turned and faced Achilles. He made one final noble plea. "Let us swear an oath," he said. "If I kill you, I will not defile your body, but return it to your men. Do the same for me." Achilles' reply was cold as death. "There are no pacts between lions and men," he snarled. "You will pay for the sorrow you have caused me." The duel was swift and brutal. Hector cast his spear, but it glanced harmlessly off the divine shield. Achilles then cast his, but Hector dodged it. Yet Athena, unseen, returned the spear to Achilles' hand. When Hector turned to his brother for another spear, he found no one there. In that moment, he knew he had been tricked by the gods, and that his end had come. He drew his sword and charged for one last, desperate, heroic attack. Achilles, seeing his moment, drove his own spear through a small gap in the armor near the neck, the very armor Hector had stripped from Patroclus. As Hector fell, gasping his last breaths, he made one final desperate plea. "By your parents, by your own life, I beg you, Do not let the dogs devour my body by the Greek ships. Accept a ransom and give my body to my family, so they may give me the rights of fire." But the wrath in Achilles' heart was a black, unquenchable fire. "Dog!" he spat. "I wish my own fury would let me cut off your flesh and eat it raw. No one will keep the dogs from your head." With his dying breath, Hector prophesied Achilles' own death at the hands of Paris and Apollo. Then he was silent. In an act of shocking brutality that horrified even the gods, Achilles tied Hector's body by the heels to the back of his chariot and dragged him in the dust, circling the walls of Troy in full view of his grieving family. For 12 days, Achilles' rage continued. He abused Hector's body, dragging it around Patroclus' tomb each morning. But the gods, Apollo and Aphrodite, protected the corpse from decay and damage. Finally, the gods could bear it no longer. Zeus sent a message to Achilles. He must release the body. That night, a silent, solitary figure, an old man cloaked in darkness, made his way through the Greek camp, guided by the god Hermes. It was King Priam, Hector's father, his heart broken but his spirit resolute. He had come on an impossible mission to ransom his son's body from the man who had killed him. He entered Achilles' tent, and before the stunned hero could react, knelt and kissed the terrible man-slaying hands that had taken the lives of so many of his sons. "Remember your own father, godlike Achilles," Priam whispered, his voice trembling with an old man's grief. "He is of my age, and perhaps he too fears for you. But I have endured what no other mortal on earth has endured. I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my child." Achilles stared at the old king, and in that moment something inside him broke. He saw not the king of his enemies, but a grieving father, just like his own father, Peleus, who would soon grieve for him. The black rage that had consumed him for so long finally gave way to a wave of profound, shared sorrow. He thought of Patroclus, and he thought of his own father, and for the first time in a long time, he wept. The two men, the great warrior and the old king, wept together in the flickering torchlight of the tent, one for his beloved friend, the other for his noble son, a moment of pure, heartbreaking humanity in the midst of a brutal war. When their grief was spent, Achilles rose. He gently lifted the old king to his feet. He ordered his servants to wash and anoint Hector's body and wrap it in fine linens, treating it with the honor it was due. He accepted the ransom and promised Priam a truce of 12 days so that the Trojans could properly mourn and bury their hero. Achilles, the fearsome engine of wrath, had found a flicker of mercy. In the shared space of grief, the conflict was, for a brief moment, humanized. The war was not over, but its emotional climax had been reached, not in the clash of swords, but in the quiet, compassionate meeting of two grieving souls. Part 6. The Fall and the Echoes. With Hector gone, the spirit of Troy was broken. The 12-day truce was a period of solemn mourning. The city echoed with the funereal wails for their fallen protector. When the fighting resumed, the Trojans were weaker, more desperate, but still protected by their impenetrable walls. The war fell back into a stalemate of attrition. Great heroes continued to fall. Achilles, the invincible warrior, was finally killed, just as Hector had prophesied. An arrow, shot by the cowardly Paris but guided by the god Apollo, struck him in his one vulnerable spot, his heel. His death sent a wave of despair through the Greek army. The war might have dragged on for another 10 years, but for the mind of Odysseus. Cunning Odysseus, the man of twists and turns, conceived a plan that relied not on brute force, but on deception. He proposed they build a giant, hollow wooden horse as a supposed offering to the goddess Athena to ensure their safe voyage home. Under the direction of the master craftsman Epeus, the Greeks constructed the colossal horse. It stood on the Trojan plain, a strange, silent, and awe-inspiring monument. The finest Greek warriors, including Odysseus himself, Menelaus, and Diomedes, hid inside its hollow belly. The rest of the Greek army burned their camp, boarded their ships, and sailed away, but only as far as the nearby island of Tenedos, where they hid out of sight. The next morning, the Trojans awoke to an astonishing sight. The Greek camp was gone, the beach was empty, and in the middle of the plain stood the magnificent wooden horse. They streamed out of the city, marveling at the strange offering. A great debate began. Should they burn it, push it off a cliff, or bring it into the city as a sacred trophy? The Trojan priest Laocoon warned them desperately. "I fear the Greeks, even when they bear gifts," he cried, and he hurled his spear into the horse's side, which echoed with the faint, telltale clang of hidden armor. But at that moment, 2 monstrous sea serpents rose from the waves, sent by the gods who favored the Greeks. They slithered onto the shore and crushed Laocoon and his 2 sons in their coils, a horrifying omen that the Trojans misinterpreted as punishment for his sacrilege. Their fears assuaged by this divine sign, and persuaded by a Greek spy left behind for this purpose, the Trojans decided to bring the horse into their city. The great beast was too large to fit through the gates, so in a final, fatal act of hubris, they tore down a section of their own magnificent god-built walls to drag it inside. That night, Troy celebrated. They believed the 10-year war was finally over. The city was filled with feasting, wine, and joyful song. They danced and sang around the wooden horse, their silent doom. As the city finally fell into a deep, drunken sleep, the hidden hatch on the horse opened. Odysseus and his men slipped out into the darkness and opened the city gates for the rest of the Greek army, which had sailed back from Tenedos under the cover of night. The sack of Troy was not a battle. It was a massacre. The Greeks, filled with a decade of pent-up rage and bloodlust, poured into the sleeping city. They set fire to the houses, and the beautiful city that had stood for generations became a roaring inferno. There was no glory, only brutal, chaotic slaughter. Old King Priam was cut down at his own household altar. The women of the royal family were taken as slaves. Hector's wife, Andromache, was given to Achilles' son. The prophetess Cassandra, whose true warnings had always been ignored, was dragged from Athena's temple and claimed by Agamemnon. And in a final, heartbreaking act of cruelty, Odysseus had Hector's infant son, Astyanax, thrown from the city walls to ensure that Hector's line could never rise again. The prophecy was fulfilled. Paris, the torch, had